I found out my daughter had quietly removed me from an $80 million trust while I was still grieving my son. The amendment was executed from my own home on a day I was out of state while my son lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life. Weeks later, I was asked to give up my bedroom in the house I had lived in for 40 years because things were different now. That was the moment I understood this was not confusion. It was betrayal. And I had to decide whether being a mother meant staying silent or standing up. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Eleanor Whitman. I am 72 years old, and I have lived in the same white, columned house overlooking the Charleston Harbor for nearly 4 decades. The house sits on a quiet stretch of South Battery, where the air carries salt and history in equal measure. In the evenings, the tide rolls in with a steady hush, and the gulls circle above the old brick seawall as if nothing in the world has ever changed. For most of my life, I believed that was true. My late husband built Whitman Coastal Development from a single rented office into one of the most respected construction firms along the South Carolina coast. He understood tides, soil, timber, and people. I handled the books in the early years while raising our 2 children, Thomas and Rebecca. We were not reckless with money. We were careful, methodical, the kind of family that believed stability was built plank by plank. Thomas, our son, was born with his father's steadiness. By his mid-30s, he was already running major projects along the Barrier Islands, speaking at planning commission meetings, studying wind maps the way other men studied sports statistics. Rebecca, younger by 3 years, was bright and magnetic, but she lived in the shadow of her brother's certainty. I tried to balance them, to praise one without diminishing the other, though I suspect mothers never quite succeed at that delicate arithmetic. 2 years ago, Thomas took his sailboat out near Hilton Head Island on a morning that began cloudless and calm. By nightfall, the Coast Guard was calling my phone. The details were clinical, the words precise, but none of them softened the truth. My son, the heir to everything we had built, was gone. The house that had once echoed with the work calls and holiday laughter fell into a silence so thick it felt physical. I would stand in the hallway outside his old room and forget why I had walked there. Thomas had been the primary trustee of the family trust, the one my husband structured to hold the bulk of our holdings and future investments. After my husband passed years earlier, Thomas stepped into that role naturally, almost protectively. Losing him was not only losing a son, it was losing the person who knew how every moving part of our life fit together. Rebecca and her husband, Lucas Grant, moved into the house within weeks of the funeral. They said they did not want me alone in a place that now felt too large. Lucas carried boxes up the stairs and fixed a loose shutter by the porch. Rebecca took over grocery lists and insisted on cooking dinners I barely tasted. When she squeezed my hand across the kitchen table and told me they were here for me, I believed her. Grief narrows your vision. It makes any offered help feel like rescue. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythms of the house shifted. Lucas began collecting the mail before I woke. Rebecca offered to simplify the finances so I would not have to look at statements that reminded me of Thomas. They used phrases like our assets and long-term planning. I told myself this was what family did in hard seasons. I told myself I was lucky. What I did not see then was how easy it is, in the fog of loss, to hand over more than responsibility. You hand over access. You hand over authority. You hand over space in your own home. And by the time you feel the difference, the rooms no longer echo the way they used to. They answer to someone else. Grief makes you grateful for any hand that reaches for you. It also blinds you to the one that might be closing around your throat. If you are still watching and you can already feel something is not right inside that house, comment number 1 below so I know you are paying attention. Now let us move into the moment that changed everything. The morning the letter arrived began like so many others since Rebecca and Lucas moved in. The tide was low, exposing a band of marsh grass beyond the seawall, and the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee I had not brewed. Lucas had taken over that habit as well. I usually came downstairs to find the mail already stacked neatly beside his laptop, sorted into quiet categories I no longer questioned. That day, though, his car was gone before sunrise. For the first time in months, I was the one who lifted the brass slot on the front door and gathered the envelopes myself. Among the usual bills and charity appeals was a thick cream envelope embossed with the insignia of Bank of America Private Wealth Division. The paper felt heavier than ordinary correspondence, the kind meant to communicate importance before it was even opened. My name was typed precisely beneath our address. I stood in the foyer longer than necessary, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the distance, before carrying it into the kitchen. I slipped the envelope carefully with the silver letter opener my husband had once kept on his desk. The letter inside was formal, almost antiseptic in tone. It informed me that the Whitman Family Trust had activated its final succession clause pursuant to the death of the primary trustee, Thomas Whitman. It further stated that the sole beneficiary listed under the most recent amendment was Rebecca Grant. The total value of the trust assets at activation was approximately $80 million. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time, tracing each line with my finger as if repetition might alter the outcome. Thomas had overseen that trust after his father passed. We had reviewed its structure together years ago, sitting at the same kitchen table with spreadsheets and coffee rings marking the margins of serious conversations. He had always insisted the trust was designed to protect me first. He once told me I would never have to worry about security as long as he was alive. Now, he was not alive, and the document in my hand suggested that at some point before his death, he had removed me entirely. Rebecca came into the kitchen while I was still standing there. Her hair was pulled back, her expression alert but composed. I handed her the letter without a word. She scanned it quickly, as if she had been expecting its contents. "It was Thomas's decision," she said, her voice level. "He did not want you burdened with business stress." The explanation felt rehearsed. Thomas had never believed I was fragile. He had watched me balance payroll during hurricane seasons and negotiate contracts when suppliers tried to raise prices. The idea that he would erase me from the trust to spare me anxiety did not align with the son I knew. Lucas returned that afternoon and moved through the house with a new decisiveness. He spoke of reorganizing accounts, of updating insurance policies, of long-term planning now that things were different. Later, in the hallway outside the master bedroom, he suggested it might make sense for Rebecca and him to take that suite. They needed the space, he said, especially with everything changing. There was no raised voice, no overt cruelty, just a calm assumption that the center of gravity in my own home had shifted. I stood at the window of the bedroom that had been mine for decades and watched a cargo ship glide slowly toward the harbor. The water did not hesitate. It did not question its direction. I, however, felt something tighten inside me. I had no proof that anything improper had happened. I had only a letter, a number too large to comprehend, and a quiet certainty that Thomas would never have made such a decision without looking me in the eye. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in my desk drawer. Until I understood what had changed, I would sign nothing. If you are still with me, and that letter made your stomach drop the way it did mine, comment number 2 below. Now let us uncover what really happened behind that signature. I did not confront Rebecca again after the letter. I did not accuse Lucas. I did something far quieter. I began making copies. Every statement I could still access, every email confirmation from the bank, every line of the trust summary that had once seemed routine. I kept them in a slim leather folder and stored it in the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath old photographs and warranty papers no one else would think to examine. Grief had made me passive. Suspicion made me methodical. 3 days after the letter arrived, I drove to Savannah, Georgia, under the pretense of visiting an old friend. Instead, I sat in the office of a financial litigation attorney recommended by a former colleague of my husband. The building overlooked a narrow square shaded by live oaks. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and printer toner. The attorney, a woman in her early 60s with careful eyes, read through the trust amendment notice without interruption. She asked precise questions. When had Thomas last mentioned updating the trust? Had I been present at any formal amendment meetings? Did I recall signing any acknowledgement of change? The answer to all of it was no. Thomas had always involved me in significant structural decisions. Even after he became primary trustee, he maintained that transparency was protection. The attorney requested the official amendment record from the bank. When it arrived electronically during our meeting, she turned the screen toward me. The amendment had been executed 3 weeks before Thomas died. I felt the room tilt slightly at that detail. 3 weeks before his death, Thomas had been in the hospital following the boating accident that eventually took him from us. He had been conscious for periods, but heavily medicated and under observation. The amendment showed an authenticated electronic signature. According to the metadata, the authorization had been completed through a secure login, verified by an internet protocol address, associated with my home network in Charleston. The attorney paused before speaking again. "You were physically present in the house that day?" she asked. I shook my head. I had been in Atlanta, attending my cousin's funeral. I remembered the date clearly because I had stood in a pew wondering how grief could stack upon grief without collapsing a person entirely. The attorney leaned back slightly, not dramatic, simply thoughtful. An electronic signature executed from my home while I was out of state. Thomas hospitalized. The timing alone did not prove wrongdoing, but it fractured the narrative I had been given. There was more. At my request, the attorney contacted the former operations manager at Whitman Coastal Development to retrieve archived materials from Thomas's office. Among encrypted backups was a personal voice memorandum Thomas had recorded months earlier while reviewing trust structure. His voice came through the small speaker steady and unmistakable. "If anything changes without my mother present," he had said, "that is not my decision." The recording ended there, ordinary in tone, yet seismic in implication. Thomas had not been planning to exclude me. He had been reinforcing the opposite. Driving back to Charleston that evening, the sky turned the color of burnished copper over the marshes. I replayed small moments in my mind, Lucas collecting the mail before dawn, Rebecca referring casually to our assets. The gentle way control had shifted away from me. Suspicion settled into shape. This was not a misunderstanding born of paperwork. It was a revision. By the time I reached the harbor bridge, I understood that silence would not protect anyone. The next morning, I returned to Savannah and signed the formal petition requesting a court investigation into the validity of the trust amendment. My hand did not tremble when I wrote my name. Once filed, there would be no quiet retreat. Whatever had been done under my roof would now have to withstand daylight. If you are still watching and you believe the truth always leaves a trace, Comment number 3 below to let me know you are here. Now let us see how far they were willing to go to protect their story. The notice from the court arrived 3 days after I filed the petition. It was delivered by certified mail, which meant Rebecca had to sign for it. She did not mention it at dinner that night, but the air in the house shifted in a way I could feel without being told. Lucas's movements became sharper, more deliberate. Rebecca spoke to me with a politeness so measured it felt engineered. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Within a week, I was served with another document, this one filed by my own daughter. Rebecca had petitioned the court for a cognitive evaluation, citing concerns about my mental state following Thomas's death. The language was sterile, clinical, and devastating. It suggested diminished capacity, impaired judgment, vulnerability to manipulation. I read it alone in my bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed that had once felt immovable in its permanence. Grief, apparently, had become evidence against me. I thought of the years I balanced payroll during recession seasons, the negotiations I handled after hurricanes tore through barrier islands, the contracts I reviewed long before Thomas ever assumed trusteeship. Now, I was being reframed as fragile. The humiliation was quieter than anger, but more enduring. Lucas approached the subject of the house a few evenings later. He spoke in the tone of someone presenting a logical improvement. The property, he explained, required significant upkeep. Insurance premiums along the coast had risen. The market was strong. Selling now would free capital for strategic reinvestment. It would simplify everything, he said. Simplify. The word lingered unpleasantly. Simplify finances. Simplify living arrangements. Simplify authority. The master bedroom, once merely suggested, was no longer presented as optional. Rebecca had already begun moving personal items into the walk-in closet. I did not protest out loud. Instead, I began packing my own belongings quietly. Not because I accepted their authority, but because I understood something fundamental had fractured. Remaining under that roof while the legal process unfolded would entangle me in daily conflict designed to exhaust me. 2 weeks later, I signed a short-term lease on a modest apartment overlooking a smaller stretch of the harbor. The space was narrow, the kitchen efficient rather than expansive, the windows facing east instead of south. It felt like stepping backward in time to a version of myself before success had widened our world. Yet, in that smaller space, I could close the door and know that every object inside answered to me alone. Distance brought clarity. My attorney continued reviewing financial records tied to the trust and related business entities. What surfaced next was not dramatic, but it was illuminating. Lucas had engaged heavily in speculative cryptocurrency investments over the past year. Several positions had collapsed. Public filings indicated outstanding obligations tied to leveraged accounts. 3 days before Thomas's boating accident, there had been documented communication between Thomas and Lucas regarding a requested personal guarantee. Thomas had declined. The refusal did not prove malice. It did not explain the accident, but it established pressure, substantial pressure. I sat at the small dining table in my apartment and traced the timeline on a legal pad. Refused guarantee, hospitalization, trust amendment executed from my home network, activation of succession clause, petition for a cognitive evaluation, proposal to sell the house. One event might have been coincidence. Together, they formed architecture. For the first time since Thomas died, my sorrow began to shift shape. It was no longer only grief. It was recognition. Whatever had happened was not an impulsive misunderstanding. It was structured, intentional, designed to transfer control efficiently and permanently. As this evening light filtered through the apartment window, I realized I was not merely contesting paperwork. I was confronting ambition that had mistaken my age for weakness. If you are still with me and you sense this is no longer just about money, comment number 4 below. Now let us step into the courtroom where everything begins to unravel. The morning of the hearing dawned over Charleston in a muted wash of gray. The harbor looked flat and metallic, as if even the tide were withholding judgment. I arrived at the Charleston County Probate Court earlier than necessary, preferring the stillness of an almost empty hallway to the scrutiny of a crowded one. The building carried the scent of polished floors and old paper, a place accustomed to the slow unraveling of private lives. Rebecca and Lucas were already seated when I entered the courtroom. She wore black, understated and deliberate. Lucas's posture was rigid, his hands folded on the table in front of him as though restraint alone could contain what the day might bring. Neither of them acknowledged me. I did not seek their eyes. The proceedings began without drama. My attorney outlined the timeline, precise and restrained. The court's attention then shifted to the digital forensics expert, a specialist in electronic authentication and metadata analysis. He explained the process methodically: secure login verification, internet protocol tracing, timestamp confirmation. The amendment to the Whitman Family Trust had been executed through a verified account tied to Thomas. The signature bore all the hallmarks of a legitimate electronic authorization. Then came the fracture. The login had originated from the internal network registered to my home address. The timestamp placed the authorization at 2:17 in the afternoon on a day when I was documented in Atlanta, attending my cousin's funeral. Airline receipts and hotel records confirmed my absence. Hospital records confirmed Thomas was under medical supervision at that same hour, sedated and monitored following complications from his boating accident. The expert did not speculate. He simply stated the facts. The room felt smaller as those facts settled. Next, my attorney introduced a series of archived emails recovered from Thomas's office servers. They were not inflammatory. They did not contain explicit admissions, but they established awareness. In one exchange, Rebecca acknowledged that the trust amendment was moving forward and noted that it would be simpler not to involve her yet. The pronoun hung in the air with unmistakable weight. Rebecca's attorney objected on grounds of interpretation. The judge allowed the emails into record, but cautioned against conjecture. Even so, the language had been spoken aloud in open court. It could not be withdrawn. The final testimony came from a former operations manager at Whitman Coastal Development, a man who had worked beside my husband and later Thomas for over 15 years. He described conversations from the months before Thomas's death. According to him, Thomas had expressed concern that Lucas was encouraging increasingly aggressive financial positions within the company. There had been discussions of speculative investments and pressure for personal guarantees that Thomas ultimately declined. The testimony did not accuse. It contextualized. I watched Rebecca during that portion of the hearing. Her composure thinned at the edges. She leaned toward Lucas once, speaking in a whisper too soft to register beyond their table. He did not respond. His gaze remained fixed forward, jaw tightened, as though stillness were strategy. What struck me most was not anger. It was distance. The family narrative that had once shielded us was dissolving under procedural language and evidentiary standards. Whatever version of events Rebecca and Lucas had constructed now had to withstand sworn testimony and documented timelines. When arguments concluded, the judge announced that she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling after reviewing the full record. There would be no decision that afternoon. As we filed out of the courtroom, the hallway seemed louder than before, footsteps echoing against tile. Rebecca passed within inches of me without turning her head. Lucas followed, his expression unreadable. Outside, the harbor wind cut sharply across the steps. I stood there for a moment, steadying myself against the rail. The truth had been spoken in a room where it could not be softened or rearranged. Whatever the court ultimately decided, silence was no longer protecting anyone. Waiting can be more exhausting than confrontation. In the weeks after the hearing, I returned each evening to my apartment overlooking the smaller stretch of harbor and felt the weight of suspended outcomes settle into the walls. The court had taken the matter under advisement. No ruling, no timetable beyond what procedure allowed. The silence felt procedural, but it was not neutral. It pressed. I kept a simple routine: morning walks along the seawall, coffee at the small wooden table facing east, calls with my attorney when updates required explanation. The world outside continued with indifferent steadiness. Boats left their slips. Tourists photographed pastel facades. The tide obeyed gravity. Inside, I replayed testimony and timelines in careful loops. The proposal came through my attorney on a Thursday afternoon. The prosecutor's office, anticipating the complexity of potential criminal exposure tied to the trust amendment, had indicated a willingness to resolve matters without extended litigation. The framework was direct. Rebecca would retain $20 million from the trust assets. I would withdraw the civil petition challenging the amendment. Further investigation into related financial conduct would not be pursued. It was presented as pragmatic, efficient, contained. I asked for the terms in writing. I read them twice before responding. $20 million was not a symbolic amount. It represented security for generations. It also represented silence. If I agreed, the public record would narrow. The digital irregularities would remain documented, but not fully litigated. Rebecca would avoid formal criminal exposure. Lucas would likely step away from scrutiny tied to his financial activities. The narrative could be framed as a family misunderstanding resolved privately. If I refused, the inquiry would continue. Depositions would widen. Forensic analysis would deepen. Rebecca could face charges that would follow her long after headlines faded. I would be the mother who chose prosecution over protection. I sat at the table and tried to separate pride from principle. Money, though large in number, had never been the core of my concern. What unsettled me was alteration without consent, revision executed in secrecy, the architecture of control assembled while I grieved. I thought of Thomas in the hospital room, monitors beeping with quiet insistence. I remembered the recording retrieved from his office, his voice firm and unambiguous. If anything changes without my mother present, that is not my decision. He had not spoken defensively. He had spoken as a trustee conscious of duty. I asked myself a simple question. If I accepted the proposal, who would I be protecting? Rebecca from consequence, or myself from discomfort? My attorney remained measured when I called her back. She did not advise one direction over another. She said only that the choice belonged to me and that either path would carry cost. There are moments when motherhood and integrity stand in tension. We are taught that love absorbs harm quietly. We are not taught how to respond when harm is deliberate. I walked to the window and watched a tugboat guide a larger vessel into dock. The smaller craft did not overpower the larger one. It directed it, steady and precise, toward alignment. By the time I returned to the table, the decision had clarified. I would not withdraw the petition. I would not trade partial security for partial silence. Whatever the full truth contained, it deserved daylight. I called my attorney and instructed her to decline the proposal. The line went quiet for a moment after I finished speaking, not with surprise, but with recognition. The course ahead would not be simple. It would not be private, but it would be honest. If you are still watching and you understand how hard that choice was, comment number 6 below so I know you are standing with me. Now let us move into Chapter 7 and face the consequences. The ruling arrived on a Monday morning, carried by an email notification rather than ceremony. My attorney called first, her voice composed in the way professionals train themselves to be when delivering outcomes that alter lives. I was seated at my small apartment table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside my hand. The harbor outside was bright with early light, deceptively ordinary. The court had declared the trust amendment invalid. The written opinion, she explained, centered on procedural irregularities, electronic authentication inconsistencies, and the credible evidence that Thomas had neither intended nor knowingly executed the amendment in question. The $80 million held within the Whitman family trust would revert to its prior structure. The succession clause naming Rebecca as sole beneficiary was set aside. I closed my eyes as she spoke, not in disbelief, but in absorption. Months of documentation, testimony, and restrained endurance had condensed into a formal acknowledgement that what I had sensed was wrong had, in fact, been wrong. There was more. Given the findings surrounding the electronic execution of the amendment and the associated financial pressures previously presented in court, the matter had been referred to the county prosecutor for further review. The language was measured, but the implication was unmistakable. This would not remain a purely civil dispute. Within weeks, formal charges were filed. Lucas was indicted on counts related to financial fraud connected to the unauthorized amendment and to separate securities violations uncovered during investigation of his speculative investment activity. Rebecca was charged as an accessory in connection with the filing of a falsified financial instrument. The proceedings moved with bureaucratic steadiness. Negotiations replaced spectacle. Ultimately, both entered plea agreements. Lucas received a suspended sentence, substantial fines, and probation. Rebecca accepted a reduced charge and similar probationary terms, along with financial penalties. There would be no prison terms, a fact that settled in me with complicated weight. Accountability had been established, but not devastation. I did not attend the plea hearing. I read the summary in the official filing instead. It was cleaner that way, stripped of facial expressions and strained exchanges. I learned through counsel that Rebecca and Lucas had begun attributing primary responsibility to one another during negotiations. The unity they had once displayed in my kitchen had thinned under legal pressure. Their marriage did not survive the process. I was told that shortly after sentencing, they began living separately. I did not inquire further. Whatever disintegration followed was no longer mine to manage. What surprised me most was the absence of triumph. I did not feel vindicated in the way dramatic narratives promise. I felt steadied. Something that had been misaligned was returned to alignment. The trust bore Thomas's original structure again. The house remained unsold. The records reflected correction. I stood one evening at the edge of the harbor and watched the sun descend into a wash of orange and violet across the water. The wind carried the same salt scent it had carried for decades. Nothing outwardly declared victory. The tide moved as it always had. The fear that once sat heavily in my chest had receded. In its place was a quieter certainty. I had not acted out of anger or pride. I had acted because the truth required articulation beyond private conversation. As I turned back toward my apartment building, I understood that the next step would not be legal, but personal. The house on South Battery was still mine. It was time to walk back through its front door. The morning I returned to the house on South Battery, the air felt thinner, clearer, as if something long suspended had finally settled. I unlocked the front door myself. The brass handle was warm from the sun, familiar beneath my palm. When I stepped inside, the scent of old wood and sea air greeted me the way it had for decades. The silence was different now. It was no longer heavy. It was simply space. Rebecca and Lucas had already removed most of their belongings. The rooms carried faint impressions of their occupancy, nail holes where frames had hung, a rearranged bookshelf in the den, a different rug beneath the dining table. None of it felt hostile. It felt temporary. I walked from room to room slowly, not to inspect for damage, but to reacquaint myself with proportion. The hallway seemed wider than I remembered. The master bedroom, once claimed without confrontation, stood open and unoccupied. I began with the study. The desk drawers had been reorganized. Files were grouped differently, labeled in a handwriting not my own. I did not rush to undo it all. Instead, I sat in the leather chair and opened each folder methodically, confirming what belonged where. Access permissions to trust accounts were restored fully into my name. Passwords were changed. Contact information was updated to remove intermediaries. Each administrative adjustment felt less like reclaiming territory and more like correcting a ledger that had drifted out of balance. There was no urge to erase every trace of the past year. I did not repaint walls or discard furniture. What I removed were the structural alterations, revised account routing, external advisory arrangements, digital permissions granted without my knowledge. By the end of the first week, the financial architecture once again reflected its original design. The idea for the Thomas Whitman Coastal Safety Foundation came quietly. I had been sorting through his project notes when I found detailed sketches for a marina reinforcement program he had hoped to implement after several minor boating accidents in the region. He had written in the margins about preventative education and improved dock infrastructure. The foundation would focus on maritime safety initiatives and technical scholarships for engineering students along the South Carolina coast. It felt aligned with the steadiness he valued. Establishing the foundation required meetings, filings, and careful drafting of mission statements. I approached it with the same deliberation I once used in early company days, beside my husband. There was solace in building something constructive. The trust assets, now secure, allowed me to fund the initial endowment without hesitation. Outside, spring moved across Charleston in gradual layers. Azaleas bloomed along neighboring fences. The harbor shifted from gray to blue as the season warmed. I resumed small rituals that had been interrupted. Morning coffee on the porch, pruning the jasmine climbing the side trellis, exchanging greetings with the neighbors during evening walks. None of it was dramatic. All of it was grounding. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. For months, I had measured my days by legal deadlines and evidentiary developments. Now, I measured them by tide charts and garden growth. The house no longer felt like contested ground. It felt inhabited again. There were moments, usually at dusk, when the memory of conflict resurfaced in fragments. I did not suppress them. I allowed them to pass through as acknowledgement rather than accusation. The truth had been addressed. The consequences had unfolded. Standing on the porch one evening, I realized that returning to this house was not a retreat into the past. It was a deliberate step forward into a life reorganized by experience. I had not merely defended a document. I had reclaimed agency. If you are still here and you can feel the calm before the final truth settles in, comment number 8 below. Now let us step into the final outcome of this story. By the time Autumn returned to Charleston, the sharp edges of the legal battle had softened into memory. The foundation was operational, the trust restored to its original design, and the house on South Battery once again moved to my rhythm rather than someone else's agenda. Routine, I discovered, is one of the most reliable forms of healing. It does not erase what happened. It simply proves that life continues without asking permission from the past. I learned through a neighbor who had heard it from a realtor that Rebecca had left South Carolina. There were no details, only that she had relocated somewhere west, perhaps Arizona. I did not confirm it. I did not attempt to call. Information traveled in small ripples, and I let it pass without pursuit. For years, I had been attuned to every shift in her voice, every subtle change in her posture. Now, I practiced something more difficult: distance. There was no dramatic apology, no midnight confession at my door. The silence between us stretched cleanly, without argument, without reconciliation. I would be dishonest if I claimed that silence did not ache. A mother does not simply sever the instinct to protect, yet I understood that protection cannot extend to shielding an adult child from the consequences of deliberate choices. Some evenings, I sat at the desk in the study, the same desk where my husband once reviewed contracts and Thomas later examined trust reports. I would run my hand over the grain of the wood and think about the layered nature of legacy. It is not only financial, it is behavioral. It is the example set when confronted with pressure. In defending the structure Thomas intended, I had also defended the principle he believed in: transparency as a form of strength. The Thomas Whitman Coastal Safety Foundation held its first scholarship award ceremony in early October. 2 engineering students from the College of Charleston stood beneath a modest banner bearing our family name and spoke about designing safer marinas and storm-resistant docks. Listening to them, I felt a steadiness settle in me that no court ruling alone could have provided. The future was being built again, not through control, but through contribution. When I walk through the house now, I do not see the months of tension that once defined it. I see the morning light angling across the foyer tiles. I hear the gulls settling along the seawall. The master bedroom remains mine, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder that space reclaimed is space respected. I have thought often about what it means to win. The word implies conquest, an opponent subdued. That is not what this has been. I did not defeat my daughter. I refuse to participate in a false narrative. There is a difference, and it matters. On the last Saturday of October, I carried a cup of coffee onto the porch just before sunset. The harbor was painted in muted gold, the tide easing inward with its familiar patience. I sat in the rocking chair my husband once favored and allowed the quiet to rest around me. The house stood steady behind me. The foundation carried Thomas's name forward. The records reflected truth. I had not preserved perfection. I had preserved alignment. And for this season of my life, that was enough. When I look back on the past 2 years, I do not see a courtroom first. I see a kitchen table, a letter opened in ordinary morning light, and the quiet shift of gravity inside my own home. The legal proceedings, the filings, the expert testimony, those were structures built afterward. The true beginning was subtler. It was the moment I realized that grief had made me easier to move. Age carries assumptions. I felt them settle around me after Thomas died. People spoke slower. They offered to handle things. They framed decisions as protection rather than exclusion. At 72, I was expected to retreat gently from complexity, to accept simplification as kindness. What surprised me was not that others believed I might be diminished. It was how easily I nearly agreed with them. There is a particular danger in being underestimated. It tempts you to underestimate yourself. I have been asked, carefully and indirectly, whether I regret pressing the case. The question is rarely about money. It is about motherhood. The implication is that a mother should absorb harm quietly, that love is proven by endurance rather than boundary. I have loved Rebecca since the moment I first held her. That did not change when I filed the petition. What changed was my willingness to participate in something untrue. Love does not require blindness. It does not require surrendering judgment in the name of unity. If anything, it demands clarity. I did not pursue legal action to punish my daughter. I pursued it because alteration carried out in secrecy erodes more than financial stability. It erodes trust itself. And trust, once distorted, reshapes every relationship around it. Family is often described as shelter, But shelter built on deception cannot stand. The Whitman name on a trust document was never the point. The point was alignment between intention and action. Thomas believed in transparency. My husband believed in earned stability. Defending the structure they created was not nostalgia, it was stewardship. I am no longer surprised by the strength required to insist on truth. Strength at this stage of life is quieter than it was in youth. It does not shout. It does not prove. It stands. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the early evening and watch the harbor settle into twilight. The tide moves with patient certainty, unaffected by human conflict. Boats return to dock. Lights flicker on across the water. The world continues, not because it is unaware of our struggles, but because it is larger than them. I have lost much. A son, a version of my daughter, the illusion that family cannot fracture. Yet I have gained something steadier, the knowledge that age does not strip you of authority over your own life. It clarifies it. I am not defined by what was nearly taken. I am defined by what I chose to protect. Some seasons in life do not end with applause or dramatic reconciliation. They end quietly, with a deeper understanding of who we are when comfort falls away. Loss has a way of stripping away illusion, and conflict has a way of revealing what truly matters. In the end, it is not money, reputation, or even victory that defines us. It is the courage to stand for truth when it would be easier to look away. It is the willingness to protect what is right without surrendering dignity. Time moves forward whether we are ready or not. What remains is the character we build in the process. Strength is not loud. Integrity is not performative. And peace does not come from avoiding hardship, but from walking through it with clarity. Thank you for being here and listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing for more stories like this.